The features of Deuteronomy, and we're going to go through these, so I'll just reveal them now. You can see how fast you can write to get them down, and if you can't get them down, you'll have to come back and fill them in. But they're all there in Roman numerals 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The second generation, the emphasis is on the second generation. The first generation has died. They're gone, with the exception of Moses and Joshua and Caleb. And so we are going to look at the second generation. It is in the plains of Moab. They are marshaling, they are staging to go into the land. And so this is at the end of the wilderness wandering. It is Moses' instruction, which fourthly is incorporates a sovereign vassal treaty format, as we saw in Exodus, but in its most advanced, its most complete form with respect to the biblical material. And it is preparation for adulthood. It is the final training of the nation. It is the final instruction of them to enter into their responsibilities as God's covenant people. And so it's an extremely important book. It really sets the stage for the rest of the Old Testament. And everything from here on out will come out of Deuteronomy, and the way God deals with the nation will be in respect to the instruction that we find in Deuteronomy. So it is the singular most important book with respect to what we will find in the rest of the Old Testament with regard to what's happening to the nation of Israel, at least the historical books and the prophetic books which are operating upon that historic material. So we're just going to work through these features to, again, give you an overview of what we're finding in the book of Deuteronomy. Second generation. The second generation is being instructed, and we just see, I want to look at some passages that look at the, specifically show us that he is focusing upon the second generation. We find in chapter 5 that he is incorporating the second generation into what he had done at Mount Sinai. And here we have Deuteronomy 5, 1-5. Moses called all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the judgments which I speak in your hearing today, that you may learn them and be careful to observe them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us." Now note the us in Horeb, Horeb being another name for Mount Sinai. "The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, those who are here today, all of us who are alive." And you say, whoa. That's not right, is it? He did make the covenant with their fathers. Why is he saying this? Well, it's what he is really saying here, and it's just the way you would express it in Hebrew, I guess. He's saying, look, I want you to realize that this covenant that was made 38 years ago, 40 years ago, at Mount Sinai was not something that is foreign to you. You were there as well. Yeah, I made it with your fathers, but not just with them. I made it with you as well. And so what he is doing is bringing the second generation into the original covenant arrangement that had been established at Mount Sinai. And what you will find throughout the Old Testament is this idea of the corporate personality of Israel. Every generation of Israel is looked at as having, in some sense, participated in the exodus out of Egypt and the redemption out of Egypt. And today, when Jews celebrate the Passover, they talked about, God redeemed us from slavery. And so you have this idea, this corporate aspect where every generation is part of all that God had done with the nation. And that is part of what is going on here. And so he is making it clear that they were part of the original agreement. Now, in one sense, they were there. They were there in their parents' bodies with respect to the potential and of becoming born, and now they're born. And that you do find in some other places in the Old Testament. But the point is that they are one. Every generation participated in that covenant. And that even is still true today. God still is dealing with the nation of Israel today on the basis of the promise he made to Abraham and the covenant in Genesis 15, and the covenant of nationhood that he made with the first generation at Mount Sinai. So the Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers only, with our fathers exclusively, you might say, but with us, those who are here today, all of us who are alive. The Lord talked with you face to face on the mountain from the midst of the fire. Now, how many of them were there at that mountain? You know, there's Joshua and Caleb's families, I think, go into the land. So technically, it's more than two, but it's not more than, a handful or two handfuls. So when he says this, he really didn't talk to them face to face, did they? Except he talked to them face to face through their parents. Yes, Liz?
Wasn't it everyone that was under 20?
Yeah, but they've all died. Well, yeah, everyone under 20. But, yeah, you're right. But there was a whole bunch that weren't there, okay? So, and these people are, now, the ones who are 40, over 40 he's talking to, but he's talking to the whole generation. And he was talking to their parents at Mount Sinai. He entered into the covenant with the first generation. They're the ones that die. So yeah, you're right. But the point is that there's only two or three, Joshua and Caleb, their families from the first generation. But he's saying you are all there. And so there's all the people that were born in the last 20 years that he is including in that as well. So the Lord talked with you face to face on the mountain from the midst of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up to the mountain. Now again, it was their parents who did not go up. It was their parents who were afraid. So you see here that he's saying that the second generation is part of everything that God had done, even though a good portion, if not a majority of them, of those at Moab, were not alive at that time. They were at best children or not even born. And so we see that the second generation is being included in the making of the covenant in the first generation. Now he goes on and says that they had been led in the wilderness for 40 years. And again, he's speaking to the second generation. They had been led in the wilderness. They had been humbled and tested in the wilderness. They had been provided for and taught in the wilderness. And they had experienced the chastening of a father for his son. Notice how this text reads, Deuteronomy 8, 2-5. You shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness. Now, we've already mentioned this before, but we tend to think of this as just an aimless wandering. They're just wandering around out there until the first generation dies. Is that really kind of the assumption that you'd made originally in thinking about these stories? But that's not the case. God was leading them. And how did they know when to move? When the cloud, the Shekinah, his manifested presence in this shining cloud, when it moved, they moved. And they stopped when it stopped. And that cloud was God. So he was leading them. He directed them as to how long they would stay at a certain place, where they would go, when they would stop, how long they would be there again until they moved to the next place. He is leading them. So while the first generation is dying, this is not just an aimless wandering around, on their own, them deciding what they're going to do for the 38 years while their parents are dying. That'd be sort of gross, wouldn't it? What are we going to do this week while some of our parents die? That wasn't it. God was in charge. God was directing them. And so we see here a looking back. I led you all these 40 years in the wilderness, and I led you for certain purposes, to humble you, to test you, to know what was in your heart. Now, God knew what was in their hearts, but they needed to know what was in their heart. And so we find a testing with a view to approving them, with a view to their benefit, with a view to their understanding. And so he says that was the reason for him leading them. So he humbled you. He allowed you to hunger. Does God ever allow you to hunger? Yeah, so he can feed you. Let's take that metaphorically, not physically. Most of us don't physically hunger too much. But God might allow you to physically hunger, but he does allow you to experience, want so that he can give you what you need. And he fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that every man shall not live by bread alone, but every man lives by every word. Or that word there that's translated word can also just be matter or issue, everything that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. It also says elsewhere their shoes didn't wear out. Boy, wouldn't that be great, guys? You have to buy shoes and clothes for 40 years. What's the point of the passage? The point of the passage is that God completely provided for them. You would expect that they would all die out there, because they would not have, the ability to continually make clothes. I mean, they only had so many animals, and they only had so much provision. So the point is, he was caring for them, and it was a caring as a father chastens his son. Now, that word chastens can have a negative aspect to it, like in regard to corporal punishment. But it also has a fuller sense with respect to the whole rigor of child raising, which involves instruction according to need and the abilities of the child, which includes verbal correction when that instruction is not attended to, which includes warning about consequences for violating instruction, which includes corporal punishment, but for the purpose of renewing or guiding a child into the right way. It's the word that's used characteristically in Proverbs of the whole child training process. And this verse says that that's the way God was dealing with the second generation, all those who were there at Moab being instructed, ready to enter the land, is that he was as a father raising them as children. And everything that happened to them in the wilderness happened for a purpose. Happened for the purpose of maturing them in their understanding, in their knowledge of him, and their ability to trust him, in their understanding of what he was capable of doing. And so this is a great image here of God in relationship to his people. And again, God deals with us as his children in the same ways, doesn't he? And the New Testament indicates this. It's discipleship. And so he was raising his son nation, preparing them to enter into their work as an adult. And of course, you have the whole imagery that you would have in the ancient Near East of a father who would always be preparing his sons for the family business, for the occupation. That's what happened. And so we have this image. And so it's a very positive image with respect to what God was doing with this generation in the wilderness. And so this is the emphasis that we see on the second generation as God was leading them through and as God was preparing them for the land. The second emphasis we see is this emphasis of the suzerain-vassal treaty. And you can jot these parts down in your outline. This is the outline that we introduced in Exodus when we noted that God was taking a very common ancient Near Eastern form of relationship between a king and his vassal kings or his subjects. It has a preamble, a historical prologue, the preamble identifying who the God is or who the king is that is relating to this people, a historical prologue that talks about what he had done for them. The stipulations, both generally and specifically with regard to how they are to live, how they are to behave themselves, how they are to carry out and evidence their loyalty to the king. And there was a section of blessings and curses in regard to what would happen if they observed the stipulations and what would happen if they did not. And these kings would call the heavenly gods or witnesses to call the gods to witness this covenant. That's no greater power could they marshal than their gods. And that was, a formality. It was sort of a stylistic way of saying, don't do this, or be you cursed. Now, God can't do that, and He doesn't do that, but He does call the stars and heavenly bodies and so forth to witness. So the created things that He has placed in the heavens, He does call to witness. And so we even see the same kind of an idea there, though it certainly isn't the gods that the peoples would look at. And so we find this the same thing in the book of Deuteronomy. We found most of this, or we found the preamble, the historical prologue, or the general stipulations, all in Exodus chapter 20, which is the chapter of what? Those of you who are already studying your key passages. Exodus chapter 20, 10 Commandments. And, I am the Lord your God. That's the preamble. Who brought you out of Egypt. That's the historical prologue. And you shall, I'm the Lord your God, just no other gods before me. That begins the general stipulations. Notice here, you've got a much longer discussion of the first two elements, the preamble and the historical prologue. And that's because this generation half or more of it did not see what God had done. And so, there's a longer time of recounting what had happened. And we find the general stipulations and the specific stipulations also being longer. Deuteronomy chapter 5 is the passage of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. And notice all the way through chapter 11, these Ten Commandments seem to be getting fleshed out in greater detail. And then there are specifics that begin in chapter 12 and run all through the way through chapter 26. And so what we find is an expansion of the instruction of the law. How much of the law were the people going to need wandering around in the wilderness? Well, not as much as they would need once they got into the land and they separated out into the reaches of the land. In the wilderness, Moses is still there in the presence of every one of them. And they are all there in the presence of the tabernacle, and God is leading them. And anything that came up that needed to be dealt with, Moses and the people that he brought into leadership with him would be able to do that. Once they get into the land, the tribes are going to be, divided around through the country, and they're not going to have Moses there to go and ask a question whenever they wanted it. And so what we find in Deuteronomy is that the specifics or the generalities of the Ten Commandments are given even more specifics as to these are the ways in which these general stipulations will work themselves out. And it gave Israel enough of information in all the different areas that they would run into that they could figure out on the basis of the law as they would apply themselves, what should happen in various situations. So this isn't a static thing. This isn't 613 laws that God gave that would cover every conceivable situation for Israel all the way through time, or even all the way through the Old Testament, because things were going to change, conditions were going to change. And what we find in studying this aspect of law and studying it in relationship to, and covenant in relationship to the ancient Near Eastern examples, is that it's exemplary, it's case law. And it's like our Constitution. Our Constitution has basic operating principles that are set forth in it as to how our nation would be structured, how it would be governed, separation of powers, and so forth. And then there's the Bill of Rights and some amendments. And then, is that all we have today to operate on? When you go into a court of law and you've got a case against somebody, does the judge sit there and looks only at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the amendments? No. What else does he have to look at? All of the rulings that have happened from the beginning of our nation as case law give precedence as to how certain cases are to be handled. And a case comes up that seems to be a whole new situation. And so they'll apply this case and this case and this case because all three of those have something to say to what you're involved in and the litigation with your neighbor. That's the way case law works. And that's what Deuteronomy is, and Exodus to a degree, is it's case law, it's situational law. It's if this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this. Well, you get down a couple of generations and you've got, well, what about this? Well, there's nothing covered like that exactly in the law, but we have enough of what God has told us that we can figure out how to handle this in a way that is in keeping with the general tenor that God directed with respect to how His people should live and what their values should be. And so Deuteronomy, we find an expansion of Exodus along those lines. And it was never intended to be, 613 laws that would cover everything and that were inviolable absolute standards. See, the problem is that's what the Jews made it in time. And by the time of Christ, that's what they were fixed upon, and they were trying to interpret everything in terms of one of those specific case laws that were given in Deuteronomy or in Exodus. And it just didn't work. And that's why Christ says, you guys just don't understand what the law is all about. And we will find that even Jeremiah saying that. So we do have the sovereign vassal treaty format again. We find it in its full form, really. And we do find it in the structure that it usually took in the ancient Near East. And so that's another of the features of Deuteronomy. Now, perhaps one of the most interesting features of Deuteronomy is the emphasis upon the relationship of God and His people, the relationship between God and His people, as being a relationship that is formulated in the terms of love. And it has to do with the fact that this is not simply to be some sort of an external thing, but it really is a relationship. It really requires a change of heart. Not love in a romantic sense, but certainly love in the sense of one of commitment, of devotion, of loyalty, and that's something that we find very interesting in here. First of all, love is a cause of Yahweh's choice, a cause of the Lord's choice. It is His love for Israel that is the reason for their birth as a nation. So love is the motivating cause, the motivation of the Lord's choice of Israel. And you've got the passages there, 4:37 to 38, 7:7 to 9, 10, 14, and 15. Here is 4:37 and 38. Because He loved your fathers, therefore He chose their descendants after them. And He brought you out of Egypt with His presence, with His mighty power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in, to give you their land as an inheritance, as it is this day. The Lord did not set His love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples. But because the Lord loves you, and because He would keep the oath which He swore to your fathers, the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And so the language of love is used to indicate what motivated God to create this nation and to bring them out of Egypt. It was the father's love for his son, his child, for his children. And this is designed to motivate them to want to live in respect to that. Love is always the greatest motivation there is for action and for devotion and for loyalty. And so we see the language of love. Secondly, love is to be the center of Israel's commitment. Love is to be the center of Israel's commitment. It is to be what is to motivate them at the most fundamental level, at the core of their being, the center of Israel's commitment. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. The great Shema, the great confession of Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And so this is right at the heart, again, of Israel's relationship to them. This is what is ultimately to motivate them. And again, you see it's an internal thing. It requires a perspective. It requires something. It requires a change of heart. And thirdly, it's the essence of Israel's obedience. Love is meant to characterize their obedience. The essence of their obedience. Again, 10, 12, 11, 1 and 13, 22, 30, 16 to 20. And these aren't all of the passages, but certainly key ones. The essence of Israel's obedience. What it says in 10:12. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you today for your good. Now, look at those terms. Look at those commands. Fear, walk, love, serve, keep the commandments. We don't tend to group all those together, do we? Think, well, serving and obeying is here and loving is over here. Does this passage distinguish like that? No. So service is not something that is demeaning. Obedience is not something that is demeaning. It is that by which they would show their love. It is the very essence of their love. The fear of the Lord is a healthy respect for who he is, but not one that results in a kind of a cowering, shrinking, oh, I'm afraid he's going to smack me today. But one that draws me to him because his character is such that while he is holy, and I should be careful how I act because of him, yet he is also love, and he draws me to him because he has extended himself to me. He's committed himself to me. And so all of these terms go together with respect to how it is that Israel would approach God. And they are still the same for us. All of these are still operative with regard to our relationship to God, how we look at him, how we conceive of him. And it is at the essence of a healthy parent-child relationship. Children fear their parents, as they should. But they fear them for their own good. They fear them because their parents have, the desire for the child to see them live in the right way. And so if a parent gives a command, an order, and it's not obeyed, and there's something to be feared as a result, but that order or that direction is for their own good. Don't run into the street to chase your balls when they go out, to the yard. Why? Well, because I don't like you, and I just want to give you another command to make your life miserable. Is that why? No. It's because you don't want to get smucked by a truck. And so, a child will learn to respond to the parent with a variety or a multi-stranded motivation. And that's what we see here. And love is of the essence of this obedience. 11:1. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God and keep His charge, His statutes, His judgments, and His commandments always. And so it is not simply a perfunctory obedience. It is not a manipulative obedience. Okay, if we do this, then God will do this. It's not that at all. It's, I love God, therefore I will keep His commands. Therefore I will obey Him. It's what is His due. So no, I mean, this is the Old Testament, right? You're not supposed to read this in the Old Testament. There it is. And it's no different for us. God loves us, and we are called to love Him, and we are called to obey Him. And the New Testament is full of the expectations of obedience. And we should be careful to observe that. You know, what does Christ say in John 14? He who has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. He makes the exact same identification, doesn't he? And he who loves me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him, and I will disclose myself to him. So you see how there you have love, keeping the commandments, experiencing a special affection of the Father, and out of that intimacy, an understanding, a better understanding of who God is. And that's what we find similarly in Deuteronomy. And so basically he's saying these laws and these commandments, all these stipulations are, they're for my holiness, they're for my honor, but they're also for your well-being. And these are the parameters of our relationship. This is how it will work. And this is how I will fulfill my purpose through you. Now, what we will find next semester when we get to the new covenant in Jeremiah is that there's going to have to be a new operative principle infused into this whole relationship because Israel's gotten to the point where it just was impossible for them to ever do this. They could not get the heart attitude thing right. And so he is going to provide something for us, for them, which he has now provided for us, and that they are yet to benefit from. So note that this covenant is a relationship between Yahweh and His people that has love as God's motivating factor. It's the essence of Israel's obedience, and that's how God is going to. That's how He works with His people. It's to be the center of their commitment.